There are some nights a parent never forgets. The night a child is born, the day they take their first steps, the morning they leave for school all by themselves, and, sometimes, the night they simply don't come home. On the evening of the 4th of December 1951, 52 Royal Marine Volunteer Cadets left Melville Royal Marine Barracks and set off along Dock Road towards the Royal Naval Barracks, where an evening of boxing, hot food and good company awaited them. They were just children looking forward to an evening with their friends. Parents watched them disappear into the winter darkness, expecting them home a few hours later. 28 returned. 24 never would. Nearly 75 years later, the Chatham Bus Disaster remains one of Britain's worst road tragedies involving children. It is a story of unimaginable loss, but also of the small changes born from tragedy that have helped protect generations of children ever since. There were few things that made a young boy stand a little taller in post-war Britain than becoming a Royal Marine Volunteer Cadet. For boys as young as 9, it offered discipline, friendship, and a sense of belonging that many would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Wearing the dark blue uniform meant something. It represented responsibility, pride, and the chance to be part of something much bigger than themselves. The responsibility for leading the company that evening rested with Lieutenant Clarence Murrayfield Carter of the Royal Marines, the unit's adjutant, and the only adult accompanying the march. Carter gathered the company together before organising the boys into 3 platoons, each under the supervision of senior cadets. The oldest and most experienced took their places towards the front, while the newest recruits, boys who had only recently joined and had not yet been issued with their uniforms, formed the rear of the column. Dressed in their own clothes, they were no less proud to be there. Once everyone had fallen into place, the company stepped off 3 abreast onto Dock Road, the steady rhythm of marching boots echoing through the cold December evening. The evening was bitterly cold. A dense fog had settled across the Medway towns, dulling the glow of the street lamps and reducing visibility to little more than a few yards in places. Dock Road was never an easy road to march after dark. The lighting was poor at the best of times, and long stretches of the road were left in deep shadow. For Lieutenant Carter and the boys, it was just another short march, one they fully expected would end with an evening of boxing before heading home again. Travelling along Dock Road that same evening was one of Chatham District Traction Company's familiar brown and cream double-decker buses. Behind the wheel sat 57-year-old John William George Sampson. Few men knew these roads better. He had spent 40 years working for the company, the last 25 as a bus driver, and the following evening he was due to receive a long service award in recognition of his years behind the wheel. Standing on the lower deck, behind the driver's cab, was the bus conductress, Dorothy Dunster. In the days before one-person operated buses, conductors collected fares, issued tickets, and helped passengers board and leave the vehicle. It was an ordinary evening's work, no different from countless journeys she had made before. By every account, Sampson was considered a careful and experienced driver. Yet, like many motorists at the time, he was driving with only his sidelights illuminated. In the dense fog, full headlights often reflected back from the moisture in the air, making it even harder to see. Using sidelights instead was common practice and perfectly legal, although some drivers chose to switch on their headlights when conditions became particularly poor. As the bus continued along Dock Road, neither Sampson, Dunster nor the boys marching ahead had any idea that their paths were about to cross. As the cadets marched steadily through the darkness, Lieutenant Carter moved quietly up and down the column, keeping an eye on the boys. The steady rhythm of boots on the road echoed through the evening air, broken only by the occasional murmur of conversation between friends. Just ahead lay the municipal swimming pool. It marked the beginning of the darkest stretch of Dock Road. One of the street lamps had failed, leaving a section of the road almost completely unlit. Behind them, Sampson guided the bus down the gentle slope towards the depot. Dorothy Dunster continued her duties on the lower deck, while the passengers had little reason to pay attention to the road outside. Then, somewhere behind the marching column, the low growl of the bus engine began to carry through the fog. Lieutenant Carter heard it too. Looking over his shoulder, he saw the bus approaching through the fog and immediately called for the boys to move closer to the curb, expecting the driver to steer safely around the marching column as countless others had done before. The boys obeyed, but the bus kept coming towards them. Aboard the bus, the journey continued as normal. Standing on the open rear platform was Mr. Dodds, who was travelling to the Royal Naval Barracks to watch his own son compete in the evening's boxing tournament. Later, he recalled, "We were going at a normal pace when I felt a series of bumps." The bus lurched. It had driven straight into the rear of the marching column. The impact was instantaneous. Boys were hurled through the air as the heavy double-decker ploughed relentlessly through the neat ranks of cadets, the silence of the evening replaced by the sickening sounds of metal, bodies, and breaking glass. At the wheel, John Sampson felt the bus shudder beneath him. Something was clearly wrong, but he had no idea what. There were more jolts in quick succession. The bus rocked beneath its passengers before slowing sharply. Some looked up from their seats. Others glanced towards the front of the bus, unsure what had happened. Dorothy Dunster stopped what she was doing, trying to make sense of the sudden jolting that had travelled through the bus. The vehicle continued forward before Sampson brought it to a halt further along Dock Road. Nobody yet realised that outside, Dock Road had become a scene of devastation. And then came the screams. The neat ranks of marching cadets had vanished. The road was strewn with caps, belts, and injured boys. Some lay where they had fallen. Others cried out for help as friends stumbled through the darkness, desperately trying to find one another. Lieutenant Carter, knocked to the ground by the force of the collision, struggled to his feet. Dazed but uninjured, he was confronted by a harrowing scene. Within moments, dockyard workers, Royal Navy personnel and passers-by were running towards the sound. As they emerged through the fog, the scale of the disaster became horrifyingly clear. One of the petty officers later recalled, "It was dark and suddenly I heard screams. It made me go cold because they were the high-pitched screams of children." Several of the cadets were trapped beneath the bus. Rescuers struggled frantically to reach them, but the weight of the double-decker made it impossible to lift by hand. Those closest could do little more than kneel beside the vehicle, speaking to the trapped boys while desperately waiting for help to arrive. Ambulances, police officers, and military personnel began arriving within minutes, but the fog made an already desperate situation even more difficult. The injured were carried to waiting ambulances, while others were rushed to hospital in private cars and naval vehicles. One moment stayed with the petty officer for the rest of his life. "I picked up a boy, and he cried, 'Oh, Mum.' I put him on the side and went to two others. I cradled them, but they died right there in my arms." As the first rescuers rushed towards the injured boys, John Sampson climbed down from the cab, still unaware of what had caused the jolting, and walked around the side of the bus. He froze. Dorothy Dunster followed him from the bus. Running around to the front, she found Sampson standing in the road, ashen-faced, repeating over and over, "I didn't see them, I didn't see them." Behind him, the road was filled with dead and dying children. Then, as the screams reached him, Sampson cried, "Oh my God, what have I done?" While rescuers fought to save the injured on Dock Road, families across Gillingham remained completely unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded. Many still believed their sons were safely watching the boxing tournament at the Royal Naval Barracks. Before long, however, word of the disaster began to spread. Parents made their way to hospitals across the Medway towns, desperately searching ward after ward for familiar faces. For some, there was overwhelming relief. For others, every unanswered question brought a growing sense of dread. By the end of the night, 17 boys had lost their lives at the scene. 7 more would die from their injuries in hospital, and 18 others had been injured, many of them seriously. Gillingham and Chatham fell silent. Almost every family in the town knew one of the boys who had been killed or injured. Schools were left with empty desks. Neighbours struggled to find the right words. For days, little else was talked about. Then, on the 12th of December, thousands of people lined the streets as 20 of the boys were carried to Gillingham Cemetery. Royal Marines served as pallbearers, while senior naval officers joined grieving families for one of the largest funerals the Medway towns had ever witnessed. The remaining boys, who were Roman Catholic, were laid to rest in separate ceremonies. For those who watched the procession pass in silence, it was a sight they would never forget. The inquest opened on the 14th of December 1951 and heard evidence from witnesses, survivors and those involved in the tragedy. It became clear that no single mistake had caused the disaster. Instead, it was a chain of circumstances that together proved fatal. The dense fog, poor street lighting and the failed lamp on Dock Road had all contributed. Although the cadets at the front of the column wore white belts and lanyards over their dark blue uniforms, those behind were newly recruited boys dressed in ordinary civilian clothing. From behind, the white belts were largely hidden from view, making the marching column far less visible than might have been expected. The inquiry also examined Lieutenant Carter's decision to march the boys on the road, the absence of a rear warning lamp, and John Sampson's use of sidelights instead of headlights. Each had played a part in the tragedy, but none alone told the whole story. Lieutenant Carter was not found to have been at fault. He told the inquest that he had seen the bus approaching and immediately ordered the cadets closer to the curb, fully expecting it to pass safely. He also insisted that the fog was not as dense as many other witnesses had claimed, and maintained that the bus had been travelling at around 40 to 45 miles per hour, considerably faster than John Sampson's or Mr. Dodd's testimony. Although the inquest returned verdicts of accidental death, the legal process did not end there. John Sampson was later charged with dangerous driving and stood trial at the Old Bailey. The jury found him guilty, but, recognising that a series of factors had contributed to the disaster, recommended that he be shown the greatest possible leniency. He was fined £20 and disqualified from driving for 3 years. In passing sentence, Mr. Justice Pilcher remarked that the mental punishment Sampson had already endured and would continue to endure far exceeded anything the law could impose. Despite the verdict, there was little sense of triumph. Many believed John Sampson would carry the burden of that night for the rest of his life. He attended every inquest into the deaths of the boys, quietly listening as each family gave evidence. Perhaps the most remarkable gesture came from some of the cadets who had survived. While recovering in hospital, the boys pooled their pocket money to buy Sampson some chocolates in an attempt to lift his spirits. It was an act of compassion almost impossible to comprehend after so much loss. Local historian Pam Mills said, "You could actually feel how sorry he was. He was a local man, he knew these boys and they knew him. In effect, he was another victim of this tragedy. He was absolutely traumatised and he lived with it for the rest of his life." The tragedy prompted a thorough review of road safety. A government committee concluded that 3 principal failings had combined to cause the disaster: inadequate street lighting, the lack of proper safeguards for marching cadets, and the failure to use headlights in the prevailing conditions. Improvements followed. Street lighting was upgraded. Organised groups marching after dark were required to display rear warning lamps. And the lessons learned on Dock Road helped to shape safer practices for years to come. Yet for Gillingham, the changes that followed could never undo what had been lost. Each year on the Sunday closest to the 4th of December, people still gather at Woodlands Cemetery. Former cadets, families and members of the Royal Marines stand together as the names of the 24 boys are read aloud. Nearly 3/4 of a century have passed since that bitter winter evening, but the memory of those boys has never left the town they called home. They had set out looking forward to an evening of boxing with their friends. 28 returned. 24 never would. Their march ended on Dock Road. Pam Mills said, "These boys, they shouldn't be forgotten." And I agree. I can't imagine how those parents must have felt, fully expecting their sons to return home after a night of fun, only to be given the news that they would never return. Despite the nature of the tragedy, I hope you appreciated the way the information was presented. I'll see you on the next one, and I'll wish you bye-bye for now.